to start this one with a very simple question. Do you like being able to cast your spells in a game of Magic? I like casting my spells. Show of hands if you like casting your spells. Perhaps, maybe, you even dabble in activating abilities from time to time. If you said yes to that question, it's very helpful to have a good mana base so you can do those things in a timely manner, because there's no easier way to lose a game of Magic than having uncastable spells in your hand. Even just one, right? Even just one uncastable spell can really matter. Welcome, everybody, to Limited Level Ups. Today's episode, we're going to go deep on how to build a good mana base in Limited. How to have some respect for the game, as Paul Cheon likes to say when he plays against an opponent who has a very bad mana base. Gotta have some gosh darn respect for the game, So I'm looking for this to be as comprehensive as possible. Something that you can come back to and reference. Something you might want to share with that one friend who splashes way too often. We're going to cover everything from the basics of what makes a good two-color mana base to how to splash responsibly, talking about multicolor decks, the different kind of mana fixers you might play, some common mistakes to avoid when building your mana base, and of course this, also echoes to how you draft your deck. There's a bunch of little tips and tricks and guidelines that I've picked up over the years for how to build a better mana base in Limited, and if I haven't made it clear already, one thing I want to hammer home is just how important I think this topic is. I think just having a good mana base is key. It's critical to winning. You can't do without it. So let's start off with two-color decks. Two-color decks where your mana base is generally going to be 8 lands of one color, 9 lands of the other. And the first thing to say about this is a bad mana base. The classic 9/8 mana base is bad. Limited mana bases in general are bad. Even when the mana requirements of your spells aren't too tough, like you're not splashing, you don't have a bunch of double pips, not a lot of like black, black, green, green. Even with none of that, you will draw forests and all black cards sometimes. You'll sometimes have trouble double spelling, right? Because let's just say you've only drawn 1 forest and 4 green cards. Well, you're going to be casting 1 green card per turn. There is a reason why constructed mana bases have a bunch of dual lands. There's a reason that throughout Magic's history, dual lands have historically been some of the more expensive cards to buy. It's because every constructed deck needs them and wants them to make their deck more consistent. We don't have that. We have to work with what we have in Limited, right? And 9/8 is kind of the best approximation of what's acceptable. Just enough to be acceptable. But it's not good. You will get mana screwed with this kind of mana base quite often. Obviously, there's ways to improve your mana base, and we'll get to that in a bit. You can pick up dual lands and such, but if you don't pick up any mana fixing, 9/8 is just what you have to work with, and it's just on the edge of acceptable. Not good, but acceptable. And one thing I want to say up front here that frames a lot of what we're going to talk about throughout this episode is that virtually in any Limited deck you ever play, the bare minimum of sources you need for one of your base colors to consistently cast your spells in that color is 8. 8 sources for each of your main colors. And this is why, when you splash, you absolutely can't just throw in 2 or 3 basics of your splash color and call it a day, because if you're playing 17 lands, 2 off-color basics means that dips into your main colors, and you dip below 8 sources, and the math says that's no bueno. You cannot do that. You will have trouble casting your spells. And by the way, on the topic of math, throughout this episode, I'm going to be throwing out stuff like, this makes a good mana base, or this makes not a good mana base. You want this number of things. And if you're wondering where all these numbers come from, where all these guidelines come from, people that are much better at math than me have run these numbers, done the math. Notably, Hall of Famer and PhD in maths holder Frank Karsten has published a ton of articles about where these numbers come from over the years. A quick Google search for Frank Karsten will bring you to those. But swinging back to the idea of 8 sources at a minimum for your base colors. Mana base building is fairly complex, and I think that it's a little bit more of an art than a science. I mean, sure, there's a science to it. I just said there's math behind it and all. But there are also a lot of factors that go into it, a lot of competing factors sometimes, especially when you're getting into multicolor mana bases. There's a lot of corner cases. Often there's not a perfect answer of how you should build more complex mana bases, because you can't put in fractions of lands or anything like that. We're sort of just working with the tools we have, which are singular units of cardboard, singular cards. You're looking for the line of best fit. Because of this, there aren't all that many hard and fast rules when it comes to mana base building. It's more like, here's some guidelines, here's some things you should follow. But the 8 sources at the minimum thing, that is a hard and fast rule. That is a rule you should not break. It's a cardinal sin to break. Now, there's a little wiggle room when your deck is very heavy one color and very light on the other. So say, for example, you're a green-black deck and you've only got 6 green cards. Okay, sometimes you'll play like 10-7 just to really respect the fact that you've got a lot of black cards. But if you're a 2-color deck that is roughly evenly split on colors, and you've got 2 drops of each color. Do not play fewer than 8 sources of your main colors, and I'm going to say it again, do not play fewer than 8 sources of your main colors. So if you start at the baseline of understanding that your 9-8 mana base, 9 of one basic, 8 of the other basic, is already pretty bad, you want to make decisions in the draft and in your deck builds to improve that mana base as best you can. And you for sure don't want to be doing things that make that mana even worse. And remember, we're just talking 2-color decks still. We're not even talking about splashing or anything just yet. So in your 2-color decks, here are some considerations to make the mana better. I think the most obvious way to improve your mana base, and the one I'm sure a lot of people are thinking of, is just make sure you're picking up dual lands, picking up Evolving Wilds, picking up stuff like Night Market, picking up the tapped dual lands that we see almost every set at this point. And to be clear, I do think this is something you should look to do in your 2-color deck. Sometimes when I'm streaming, I'll get a question from chat being like, oh, you're just drafting 2 colors, you're not splashing. Why did you prioritize that Evolving Wilds or that Terramorphic Expanse? Well, everything that I've said so far is the answer, right? Your mana base is bad. You want to make it better. And picking up a dual land, like if you're black-green, picking up a Jungle Hollow, for example, at some point. That's the, just the tapped enter the battlefield land that gains you a life when it enters. Every time you draw that card in your opening hand or at some points in the early parts of the game, that's just going to make your mana base so much better. It's going to mean that you can double spell easier. It's going to mean that you can cast your black cards and your spinouts on turn 3, your murders a little more often. Every dual land you can draft is a huge upgrade on a basic land. Now, of course, there is at some point a point where you say, well, sure, I'm adding a bunch of dual lands to my deck, but most of the time these dual lands are going to be tap lands, because that's the generally common variants are tap lands. So you've got this trade-off of the more dual lands you pick up, the more you'll be able to actually cast your spells, keep opening hands more often, but the more dual lands you pick up also means that more tap lands you have, and the more likely that you'll draw multiple, affecting your curve out in a meaningful way. So the fix for this is, I think you're aiming for 2 dual lands. That's the way the math breaks is 2 dual lands tends to be right at that nice point where it's like, yes, once in a while, maybe it'll affect your curve out for a turn, but you'll be able to cast your spells, double spell, cast your double pip cards, all that good stuff. So yeah, you're losing something in there by adding tap lands. And I know this is something that people sometimes have a tough time reckoning with because they remember the times when they draw that tap land right on that turn they needed the untapped land. I'm not saying there's no downside to them. Of course, there is some downside to them, but the upside you gain, I do think is worth it. So I'm looking for 2. 2 dual lands is my Goldilocks zone for tap dual lands in 2-color decks. There's also the argument that I've heard kind of go either way of, should you play those 2 tap lands in your red-white aggro deck, right? Because oftentimes you're playing that tap land, if it's in your opening hand, on turn 1, where a lot of times, you're not playing a 1-drop in some other non-aggro deck. But in your aggro decks, you want to be able to go 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop. And this is a notable point where, it becomes a little bit more of an art than a science. It becomes a little bit vibes. It becomes a little bit like the context of your deck really matters. Because if your red-white aggro deck doesn't have 1-drops or only has 1 or 2, then you're not really losing out that much by playing 2 dual lands, just like any other deck, right? You can play it on turn 1, not a huge deal. In your aggro decks, arguably, you want to be having that consistency even more than in other decks, because if you do stumble on a color in your aggro decks and you don't hit it until turn 4, turn 5, it can be just game over, right? Because you just need to be consistent in the aggro decks. But if you do have something like, 5 1-drops, then maybe I'd only play 1 dual land. I do think that you should play 1, even in your low curve decks, that just the bump to your mana base you get is still worth it. But like I said, I think there is an argument to be had for 1 over 2. In some super low curve aggro decks, maybe you don't play 2 dual lands. There's also the question of where do you take these dual lands in the draft? And my stance on it is that if you already know your colors, like you're going to be black-green, you're halfway or more through the draft, you should take the first dual land pretty highly. There's going to be some drafts where you can't afford to take a land over a good spell. Sometimes you go through the draft and you only settle in your color pair at, pack 3, or you had to pivot, or, basically the more time that you had to spend not in your base colors that you end up in, the less highly you can take a dual land, because sometimes you have to take something else. But if you're already like, yeah, I'm 17 playables to my 23 playables, I'm going into pack 3, you only have to pick up 6 more spells to make playables, that's exactly where you should prioritize a dual land very highly. And if you've listened or watched limited Magic content for a few years at this point, you'll probably have heard other content creators, or even myself, say this, something along the lines of, take lands highly, take lands highly. I think this gets a little bit misconstrued sometimes, because where I think this maybe gets misapplied once in a while is people will draft lands in pack 1 very, very highly when they don't know what their color pair is, when they don't have a reason to splash or anything just yet. I think generally in pack 1, you want to be finding your color pair, you want to be taking powerful spells. I mean, sure, if there's a land in the pack, there's nothing else that you're very excited about, totally fine to speculate on it. Or if you started with an A-level bomb, like a gold card that you want to play for sure. Let's just say you open up a Sabsunin in Aether Drift and you're like, well, I really want to play this Simic gold card, but I don't think blue and green are that open. Sure, you figure, okay, well, maybe red-blue is open, and you pick up green duels pretty highly, so you compare that rare. Yeah, absolutely, that makes sense. But generally, in pack 1, in the early parts of pack 2, when you don't know your color pair just yet, I do just like taking the good spells. But of course, it's not just the lands you can pick up to make your 2-color mana bases better. What spells you draft matter a lot for how good your mana base is. And I'm not just talking about picking up green fixing and mana rock, stuff like that. You can't do that every single deck. I'm talking about treating your 2-color decks more like they're a 1-color deck with a splash rather than split down the middle with both colors, right? So ideally, in my blue-black deck, one of those colors is a base color, and the majority of my cheap cards and my double pips are going to be in that base color. You don't want to have 3 mana cards that are 1 blue blue and 3 mana cards that are 1 black black, because in most games, you won't be able to choose which one you cast on turn 3. I find often when I look at other people's drafts, they tend not to respect this as much as I think you should. So when you settle into your color pair, let's just say you're at the end of pack 1, you're like, okay, I am blue black. I think from that point, people kind of look at blue cards and black cards just like, okay, well, I'm blue-black. I might as well take the best of the blue and black cards I have presented to me in every pack. But I think, once again, you want to streamline your mana. You want to make some concessions. So an example of this is if you're drafting a blue-black deck and you're faced with the pick of Spin Out, which is a 1 black card, and Flood the Engine, which is a 2 and a blue card, and blue is your base color. You have mostly blue cards and maybe 3 or 4 black cards scattered in there. I'm going to want to take the Flood the Engine. Flood the Engine is a slightly worse card than Spin Out, I'll give you that. But if black isn't your base color, and you don't have, let's say, 10 black sources in your deck somewhere, then that Spin Out isn't going to be a 3 mana card in half your games. It's going to be a 4 mana or a 5 mana card, or a card that you can only play on 4 or 5. So the appeal of it goes down quite a bit. Because yes, there are a lot of games where you don't need to spend a removal spell on turn 3. That's not what you're doing. But there are a lot of games also where your opponent plays a really, really good 3-mana card. And you're like, man, I would really like to kill that on the spot right now. And taking away that option by drafting a mana base that's not as good, not respecting those double pips, does land you in hot water a little more often than you might expect. In Retail Limited, you don't always have the option to do this. Sometimes you're drafting your deck and you just go, okay, well, I would love to have a base color, but I don't have my pick of every single blue and black card at this table. It seems other people are drafting these colors. Sure, sometimes you just don't have that option, right? You're scraping together 23 playables. You gotta take sometimes a double black card in your heavy blue deck. Understandable. But where this comes up and you do have a lot of agency a lot is in cube. So when you're drafting a red-white aggro deck, for example, you really, really want to make sure that all of your cheap cards are of 1 color rather than split between red and white. And you also want to make sure that you don't have double pips of red in your red-white cube aggro deck, because if your early game is like play a 1-drop on 1, and then on 2, you might even have a white-white 2-drop. That's something you don't see very often in normal limited sets, but in Cube, the rares tend to have double pips more often. You really, really don't want to play a Seasoned Pyromancer in that deck, right? Like a 1 red card. You just won't be castable as often as you'd like. And then, like I mentioned, it's not just about making your mana better, but making sure you don't make it any worse than the normal 9/8 is. And I think the place where this comes up the most, where people make their mana bad, is they splash a bit too readily. I do think the average player splashes more often than they should. I also think that good players, myself included sometimes, also fall into this, splashing more often than they should. Basically, your bar for splashing should be very, very high. It should be a A-level rare. Or sometimes you're splashing removal because your deck has absolutely none and you go, okay, it fills a role in my deck, I need to splash it. Even when you are splashing for reasons that I think are, respectable and responsible, you still need to have a good mana base. You still need to make sure you're picking up fixing. And we're going to get to splashing guidelines in a few minutes here. But I often see people doing something like, they're drafting blue-green exhaust in Aether Drift, and they see a Boom Scholar, the 1 red-green gold signpost uncommon, and they're like, oh, that's got synergy with my deck. I could try to splash that. Boom Scholar is just not quite at the level. It's not quite powerful enough that I'd be happy making my mana base worse for it. So if you're making your mana base worse, and let me be clear, every time you splash, you are making your mana base worse, either by having to play a basic plus some tap lands, or even if you do pick up a lot of dual lands, you're making your mana worse by having a bunch of tap lands. Like 2-color decks do have better mana than multicolor decks a lot of the time, or decks that are splashing. So when you're making your mana worse, you got to make sure it's worth it. The card you're splashing is worth it. It's good enough. Or your deck just can't get by if you're not splashing, or whatever it is. I also find that people sometimes end up splashing because out of necessity, basically because they didn't lock into 2 colors of a base early enough in the draft, and they're like, well, I have some blue cards and some white cards, and I picked up a Pactol Terror, and that plays pretty well in my Esper artifacts. I guess I'm not sure, maybe I'm still blue-black, right? Indecision can lead to your mana base being worse, because you just get to the end of the draft and you're like, I literally cannot play 2 colors without splashing. So you want to avoid that, definitely. That's a whole other topic, or that's a draft issue. You want to avoid being wishy-washy there. But given the choice to splash, if you're like, hey, I could be 2 colors, when I do deck techs, a lot of the time, I just say, you know what, we're going to cut the splash from this deck. That's what makes this deck better overall. And then finally, for your 2-color decks, a way that you want to avoid making your mana even worse than it usually is you want to avoid colorless lands if you can. Whenever we do set reviews, if I see a colorless land, my mindset is usually, this has to prove itself before I want to include it in my deck. So there are some colorless lands that are worth it. Don't get me wrong. For example, Fountain Port from Foundations, that's the one that draws cards, makes tokens, makes treasure tokens. That's a good enough card, does enough stuff that I'm willing to accept a colorless land. I'll still want to make sure that my mana is good, making sure my spells are easy to cast. When you have colorless lands that you do deem worthy, you want to make sure you avoid double pips in your spells if you can. Sometimes you play your colorless land as an 18th land, sort of as a spell, pseudo spell. So an example of the opposite is a Vishkar Raceway and all the Raceway lands. The ones that start your engines, then do something when you get to max speed. I don't think these are good enough. I have played these in the past as an 18th land, but there's no deck that I would ever play 8 and 8 of my base colors plus a colorless land if that colorless land is the Raceway. It's just not powerful enough. And especially, this goes for aggro decks too. I've seen so many times my opponent, my red-white aggro opponent or black-red aggro, they have a Raceway, and then, I look at their hand, I cast a card that looks at their hand, and I see a double black card and multiple red cards that they can't double spell with. So, the Raceway, that's the one, by the way, I haven't read this out for audio only, but this is the one that lets you discard a card and draw a card once you've gotten to max speed. And you can think, oh, in my aggro deck, I really want to be able to get through lands. I don't want to flood. But it's so much more important in your aggro deck to just be able to cast your spells on time. So yeah, this just goes back to be picky about your mana. It is really, truly a big cost to play a colorless land. I can't stress that enough. And just quickly, if you're enjoying the show, do consider checking out the Patreon if you'd like to support us. That's patreon.com/limitedlevelups. Link is going to be in the description, both of the YouTube video and of the podcast. It is the #1 place you can go if you like my content, you want to support us, you want the weekly level ups to continue. There's, of course, a bunch of rewards over there, a bunch of reward tiers. Those range from getting deck log review help to deck tech help, coaching at the top tier, a bunch of other rewards over there. Go check that out. Also, Discord rewards. We have a limited level ups Discord that I don't think I shouted out enough. Really great place over there. Lots of like-minded people that'll want to help you get better at limited. I'm there every day doing deck techs for the patrons and just interacting with people. Really great place. So you can go find that in the links in the description as well. So yeah, go check out that Patreon if you want to support, and thank you so much. If you don't want to support in a monetary way, I would also suggest liking, commenting, subscribing on the YouTube video. Really, really does go a long way. Let's get back to the show now. All right, so let's depart from 2-color decks and go up a rung, talking about when you're a 2-color deck and you're splashing a card or two. Whenever you're splashing, it's always a trade-off of power versus consistency, right? That's always what you're weighing. Is the power of the card that I get to play, the off-color card, worth to hit the consistency? I think the first thing to consider when you're trying to figure this out is, how good is my 2-color deck? If I don't splash in this deck, is it still pretty strong? So I've got a blue-black artifact deck in front of me from Aether Drift, and this deck, it's really strong. It's got a good curve. It's got some good interaction. It's got double Pactol Terror, double Haunt the Network, double Spike Shell Harrier. It's got a Winter Cursed Rider, good rare in there. This deck does not need power. And I could, if I wanted to, I have the option to splash a Guidelight Pathmaker, which is the blue-white gold vehicle that goes and searches out another artifact, 6-mana card. And I've got a Marshal's Path Cruiser in this deck to go get a basic land. I picked up a Tranquil Cove and a Night Market in the draft. I could splash this Pathmaker. I've got the sources. But I then asked myself, well, what is this replacing? And right now, looking in front of me, I've got 41 cards. And I go, what's the worst card in my deck? So the worst card in this deck is probably the second in Nimblethopterist, the 3/2 that makes a 1/1 token. Pretty solid card still. So if the worst card in my deck isn't getting upgraded that much, Path Cruiser is a solid card. Cares about artifacts at all, synergistic. It's all good stuff. But if it's not that big of an upgrade, which I don't think it is, I'm just not going to splash my deck that's already very strong. But here's where it gets tricky. Let's say instead of splashing a blue-white gold card, just, solid uncommon, you have a Sabsunin in the pile, right? The blue-green mythic that I've been talking about all draft is kind of the de facto card you would like to splash. So let's change this a little bit. Instead of a blue-white land and a blue-white gold card you picked up Sabsunin and a blue-green dual land. Well, now, again, I do the same evaluation. I go, what's my worst card? Well, it's still Thopterus, but now the upgrade you're making is gigantic, right? So your deck is good still. I still like this blue-black two-color deck, but it's worth it here, right? This is the weighing of power versus consistency. It's not static, just like, nope, this deck is good, it doesn't need to splash. It's also not like, nope, this deck is bad, it should splash. You also have to consider how much you're gaining by splashing whatever card it is, right? The particular card you're splashing, that matters. That really factors into my decision if I'm going to splash or not. You also want to consider how time sensitive the card you're splashing is. So if it's a really impactful 5 or 6 mana card, then, that's totally fine. But something you'll hear often is don't splash 2-drops, right? And there's some truth behind that, right? It's generally worse to splash a 2-drop than it is to splash an expensive card, because when you finally find your mana for that 2-drop, well, generally the 2-drop is going to be a less impactful card than a 6-mana card would be. So if you're like, well, this card's stuck in my hand forever, and then you finally draw the color of mana that you need to cast the card, it might not be good enough, right? That said, there are still some 2-drops that are impactful enough that I would be okay splashing them. So, for example, again, to use Ether Drift cards as an example, Dragonautics Engineer. This is the 2-mana red creature that exhausts to make a 4/4 dragon. That card's good no matter when you draw it. Saita Varma, Mass Racer, the blue-green gold card with the exhaust ability to pump your team. Same thing, right? No matter when you draw Saita, she's going to be pretty good. I wouldn't, however, splash something like Gastel Thrillseeker, which is the red-black 2/3 start your engine card that drains the opponent when it comes in. Like, this is a 2-drop that, yeah, maybe it's a hasty Death Toucher, but is that really the kind of card you want to splash in, like, I don't know, a black-white deck or something? Probably not. You really want to say, when I draw this card, or when I draw the mana to finally cast this card, it's going to have major impact on the game, and here's the real kicker, right? It needs to make up for the fact, it needs to be good enough to make up for the fact that you might have had a dead card in hand for several turns. Because if you have a dead card in hand for several turns, you will be playing that game less efficiently and less well than an opponent who doesn't have dead cards. Just really that simple. So it really needs to be like, okay, I've been behind a little bit. I've been essentially effectively down a card from what my opponent had access to. I need to make sure that when I do draw that mana, I say, yes, okay, finally I slam this card, and it was worth having that dead card. Also, in general, you don't want to be splashing in your aggro decks. This is a really, really common thing I see a lot of the time. The reason being that, I've been saying it throughout the episode, but your aggro decks, they need consistency. And when you splash, you become less consistent. But once again, it's not a hard and fast rule that you should never splash in your aggro decks. Like, would I splash Sabsunin in a red-green aggro deck if I had the fixing? Yeah, of course. That's definitely something I'm looking to do. But my bar for splashing my aggro decks is very, 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 very high. And I would just say that if you're unsure if you should splash in your aggro deck or not, the answer is probably no. It's definitely a proceed with caution kind of thing. It's you got to make sure you know what you're doing kind of thing. 9 times out of 10, or maybe even 9.5 times out of 10, I would just say don't even think about splashing in your aggressive deck. So let's get to the numbers. If you do say, yes, I would like to splash, this seems like something that is good for me to do, the sources you need to be able to splash a singular card, somewhere between 3 and 4 sources. And that could be lands, that could be fixers like Yellowheart Bike, or Starting Call, Manalith variants, anything that makes that additional source. I wouldn't necessarily count Treasure, by the way. Treasure, I kind of see as like, it greases the wheels for your splash, but I don't think you can count it as a true source, because let's just say you have a creature that says, when this enters the battlefield, you make a treasure token. Well, if you're counting that as a splash source for your splash card, you're basically dedicating the treasure that you make off that card specifically to your splash card. So you're saying, I'm not going to spend this treasure on anything else than my splash card. Otherwise, you're effectively trying to play that splash card on fewer sources than is required, than is just responsible to do, right? So yeah, really looking for lands, things that go to search out lands, again, like any mana rock kind of style card. And traditionally, you'll hear people say 3 sources for 1 card. That's kind of like been the gold standard for the past, I don't know, 25 years of limited Magic. And I actually think in modern times, it's closer to 4 sources for 1 card. The reason being that games just go a lot faster than they used to, right? Like games only last 8 turns, whereas back in the day, maybe they lasted 9, 10. And the logic behind the 3 sources is that it's saying over the course of an average game, given, X amount of turns, you're going to see one of those sources on average. It's going to be pretty reasonable, 80% to see one of those sources or something like that. But when games are shorter, that skews things a little bit, right? Like now your frame of time to find that source has been short, which then means you want more sources to be able to find it a little more easily or a little quicker. And so basically we're using, I think, a little bit outdated principles. So yeah, I would really, really be looking for 4 sources when I'm trying to splash my 1 card. Again, the more expensive your card is, the more time you have to find those sources. So, just one more little thing to make you want to splash expensive cards rather than cheap cards. And so let's just say, you're splashing Sabsunin in your red-green deck, and you've got a Veloheart Bike, you've got a Thornwood Falls, which is the blue-green land, and a Swiftwater Cliffs, that's the blue-red land. That's acceptable. If I'm there, I'm like, yes, I will splash the Sabsunin, but I would like to find a 4th source if I could. It's also ideal if you don't play a splashed basic, right? Like if you don't play, in this case, in your green-red deck, you don't play an island. Now, this isn't the case if you have a way to go fetch the island, so something like Marshall's Path Cruiser. Of course, you play the island then. But if you have no way to search out the land, it's ideal to not have to play a off-color basic. And I'm going to reiterate, remember, you never, I think even for the best of the best cards, you basically never want to play 2 basics of that splashed color. To give you a practical example, when I had Andrea Mangucci on the show a few weeks ago, he was talking about his Pro Tour drafts, and he actually got past a Sabsunin, and he was drafting a green-white deck, and he ended up not being able to play it, right? He said, I have 1 piece of fixing. I think it might have been like a Veloheart Bike, but he said, even with this being the best card in the set, I don't have the fixing to responsibly play it, so I'm just not going to. And something that's a little bit unintuitive when it comes to fixing in this kind of situation is that a red-green dual land for your base red-green deck will still improve your mana base. It still helps the splash because it gives you more sources for your main colors. So if you do have to play a basic island, for example, you feel more comfortable about that because that Rugged Highlands, that red-green land in your base colors, still lets you keep a good number of sources for those base colors. I could even stretch this maybe to say that if I had multiple Rugged Highlands, I might feel comfortable playing 2 islands in that spot. Because just think about it as you have 17 lands, and let's say 14 of them are basics in your main color, so 7 mountains and 7 forests. And then you've got double Rugged Highlands, so that puts you up to 9 sources of red and green. Then your 2 islands, it's still a little bit painful. If you ever draw those 2 islands, it's really, really bad. But I could stomach that kind of splash for the best card in the set. Also, for those best of the best cards in the set, what I might do if I don't pick up enough fixing. Let's just say, again, same situation, you're a red-green deck, you only picked up 1 piece of fixing, a Thornwood Falls, blue-green land. A fix to this might be to play 2 islands and 18 lands. Because then you still retain your minimum of 8 sources for each of your base colors. So you get to play like 7 forests, 8 mountains, Thornwood Falls, so it's, 8 red, 8 green. Then you play 2 islands, you play 18 lands, and your sources are there for all the cards. And you're going to flood a little more often. You're playing 18 lands, so once in a while you're going to draw an excess land that you don't want. But you're making the trade-off of saying, okay, I will flood a little bit more often, but I get to play Sabsunin, or whatever that busted A+ bomb is, and that's an okay trade-off, right? I'm okay getting flooded a little more often if I get to put this card in my deck. Yeah, this is just like a perfect example. This is what I mean by, yes, there are rules to follow, very, very strong heuristics that I would say 9.5 times out of 10 follow, but there are still exceptions. You only have these exceptions to the rule once in a while. I'm talking about these corner cases that, in my drafts, I do maybe once every 100 drafts or something like that. But they do come up, even though I think you should be generally pretty strict about your mana. Also, one last thing about splashing a single card that I think I should call out because I get this question a lot. When I say splashing a single card, really what I mean is splashing a single pip, not a double blue card. So everything I just talked about as far as numbers go does not apply to something like Mu Yanling, which is 2 blue. The math is just completely different when you need to find 2 sources. Your minimum number of sources for a double colored card is something like 6 or 7 at a bare minimum, right? It's basically a card in your main colors at that point. And I've done it before. I've splashed a double pipped card before, but that was only when I had ample fixing. I had those 6-7 sources in dual lands, in 5-color fixers, whatever it is. So yeah, just a word of caution, if you didn't make that distinction between a single pipped card and a double pipped card, big difference there. Can't use the numbers, the math interchangeably. So now, what if you are splashing multiple cards? Well, if you're splashing 2 cards, the sources go from 3 to 4 to 4 to 5. Again, 4, bare minimum, 5 is where it gets kind of comfortable. When you're splashing 3 cards, it's like 5 to 6 sources, the bare minimum of 5, comfortable number of 6. And then past that, like if you're splashing more cards than that, something's probably gone wrong in your draft. Like something kind of went funny. I'm not talking about a multicolor deck that is designed to be casting multiple color cards. I'm just still talking about 2-color deck with a splash. If you're splashing 4 cards, you probably shouldn't. And if you have to by necessity, then yeah, something probably went wrong in the draft. It's pretty rare that I splash 3 cards. 2 is like semi-common in formats like Aether Drift or formats that are friendly to splashing. But yeah, well, once you get there, it's just hard to get that number of sources is the problem. Like 5-6 sources, that means multiple dual lands. It means probably a few 5-color fixers. Part of the reason I wouldn't recommend this is because that means, again, you have to play a lot of tap lands at that point. Or if you're not playing a lot of tap lands, you're playing a lot of spells specifically just for fixing, right? And that means that your spell base overall is less impactful. It's less action. It's more cards dedicated just to cast your other cards. So this is why, a single card splash is the most common. Double card splash once in a while. Triple, quad splash, that's where you get to the point where it's just like, yeah, something, you might want to reevaluate how you got there. So that's splashing in your 2-color decks. Now let's move up one more rung. So talking about 3-color decks. And usually you only want to play a 3-color deck in formats that are designed to play 3-color decks, because there won't be enough fixing otherwise. And, funnily enough, our next format, Tarkir Dragonstorm, it's a 3-color format. And what your decks tend to look like in 3-color formats, if you're building a responsible mana base, isn't just split across the board 3 colors evenly. That's a mistake that I know I made when playing original Khans of Tarkir. This is when I was first learning Limited. I was just like, split it across 3 colors, just 3-color set. It kind of seems like that's what you're supposed to do because you've got some fixing. But even with dual lands of commons and other ways to grease the wheels, there's some cards they've already previewed for the new set that are just like creatures that help you filter your mana. So you're going to have additional sources in there. Even then, if you're aiming for a consistent 3-color deck, quote unquote 3-color deck, you're aiming to be a 2-color base deck still, just splashing more cards than you might often in a normal format. And so what this looks like is something like this Streets of New Capenna deck I have in front of me. I'm using a Streets of New Capenna deck because that's the last time we had a true 3-color format, or like a faction 3-color format. And as you can see, I'm still base 2 colors here. I'm still just a blue-black deck, but I'm splashing like 4 to 5 cards. And I'm only able to splash that many cards because of the set infrastructure, right? Dual lands at common, tri-lands at rare. There are spells that help you fix mana, some treasure to grease the wheels. There was that cycle of the expensive 3-color cards that you could like exile from your hand to give one of your lands the ability to tap for 3 colors of mana. Like there's tools to be able to splash 4 to 5 cards, but I'm still looking to be base 2 colors. And I got some comments or some questions in preparation for this episode of like, what does a true, like an actual 3-color deck look like in Limited? Like a full-on 3-color deck. And I don't think you should really be trying to draft that kind of deck. I just don't think the mana really works. It'll be inconsistent. You can certainly have a deck where you get lucky, you cast your cards in time, you draw your spells, sure. But once again, all this mana-based stuff is about consistency. So going into Tarkir Dragonstorm, I think this is what we're looking for. And, we haven't seen the full set yet, but so far from what I've seen, that seems to be the set structure. You're going to want to find a 2-color base, an enemy 2-color base, by the way, because these are wedges, not shards. And then play, splash your 3rd color for powerful gold cards or, whatever cards you see. That's kind of the idea between a 3-color mana base. And we're going to go, I'm sure, a little more in depth on 3-color mana bases once we get to that format in a few weeks. So stay tuned for a little more in-depth stuff on 3-color mana bases. And then finally, going up one more rung, we're getting to the true multicolor decks, the 4 to 5 color decks. Sometimes you want to draft this in formats that just support multicolor decks, like, 3-color formats. Sometimes will support a 5-color deck. Sometimes there's just enough fixing in the format to be like, yeah, I can just play a bunch of good cards. Sometimes you've got a really good 5-color rare. So the Kami War from Kamigawa, that was a really good one. Really good incentive to play all 5 colors. And I actually think that the mana for building a 5-color deck is kind of easier than for some other decks. Because when you're building a 5-color deck, you kind of can't do it unless you have multiple 5-color fixers. And when I say 5-color fixers, I mean cards that make any color of mana and don't lock you in to a singular color. Just a quick aside, because I just thought of this now, but that's actually an important concept in general for any deck that's playing multiple colors, is that lands or cards that lock you into a color are worse at fixing you than ones that are, just dual lands, just something that will come in tapped and tap for one of two colors. So in Ether Drift, we've got Night Market, right? That would be an example of something that locks you in. And yeah, it's always, it's a source of whatever you need. But if you're playing multiple colors and you say, okay, I call black on this Night Market, and then your next draws are like a green card and a blue card, and you don't have that mana, well, it's so much worse than if you had a Veloheart Bike, right? Because you could actually cast all those cards. So that's the kind of thing that happens a lot in 4 to 5 color decks. You end up with a lot of different colors of spells you need to cast on time, and really the only way to reliably do that is through 5-color fixers. Like Veloheart Bike, there was a Salvaged Mana Worker from Dominaria United. This is the 2-mana 1/3 that you can pay a mana to add a mana of any color. Activate is only one per turn, so it kind of filters your mana to whatever you'd like. And the setup for a 5-color deck or a 4-color deck, multicolor deck, is actually kind of similar to the setup for a 3-color deck I was talking about, where you're not straight on 5 colors, right? You still want to have a base, but instead of splashing, 4 or 5 cards of one color, like you are in the 3-color deck, you're splashing, a handful of cards of multiple colors. And you're allowed to do that because in this deck, for example, like I have in front of me, I've got multiple 5-color fixers. This is the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty deck. I am splashing Kami War. I'm playing Kami War here. I'm black-green base. I've got some blue cards I'm splashing. I've got some white cards I'm splashing. But I'm able to do that because I've got a bunch of lands that fix my mana, and mainly here, I've got 4 5-color fixers, 4 network terminals, which is kind of like a starting column, just a manolith, and 4 grafted growths, which are enchantments that make your lands tap for any color of mana. And that's mostly the key to 5-color decks. Like I said, it's actually not as complicated as it might seem. When you're trying to figure out how many sources you can play or how many splash cards you can play, it's kind of the same math, actually, as for 2-color decks in the splash. And then, yeah, so let's just walk through this. Just like the 2-color and the splash decks, I'm looking to have 8 sources of my base colors, and this deck has those for each of my base colors, green and black. There's 8 sources of those in just the lands. And then since I'm splashing 3 white cards, well, go back to, okay, so for 3 cards, you need 5 or 6 sources. And I'm just counting, okay, double network terminal, double grafted growth, plus some white lands. That's enough, right? That's 5 or 6 sources. Same thing with the blue cards, 3 blue cards. Same thing applies. There's 5 or 6, even more than that actually, for the blue card. So yeah, this is the same math. It's actually the exact same calculations. And same rules apply. You don't want to go below 8 sources of your base colors, especially when that color is green, and it helps you get to your other colors. There's also a very particular kind of 4 to 5 color deck that you'll see sometimes. And that kind of deck comes up when you have a green mana dork that taps to add a mana of any color. Usually this is, at common, there'll be some sort of cost associated with it. So in Brothers War, going back a few years at this point, although I guess a lot of the examples from this episode are, but Brothers War had Sentinel Stalwart, which is a single green mana 1/1 that you could tap it and tap an untapped artifact or creature you control, add 1 mana of any color. Kaldheim had just Spear Sentinel, which is a very similar card. And if you can get 4 or 5 of these cards, then that can enable a 5-color mana base, right? Like, again, this is a 5-color fixer, taps for mana of any color. When this is the case, you really, really want to make sure that you've got a lot of green sources in your deck, in your lands. So the deck might look something like this, right? Again, this is just one of my Brothers Wars trophies that I found. It's got 4 Sentinel Stalwarts, it's got a Springleaf Drum, which is kind of the exact same thing as Stalwart, but in artifact form. I'm running 10 forests in this deck to make sure I can cast my Stalwarts on curve, and then just, a bunch of cards of other colors. Kind of like 5-color green is something you see in a bunch of formats where the 5-color fixer you're getting is from your green cards, so your actual land base is going to be mostly green sources, and then you just want to make sure you can cast those 5-color sources or 5-color fixers. Those will cast your other cards. Again, I'm glossing over a little bit of nuance, a little bit of the intricacies, a little bit of the nitty-gritty details, because not because I don't think it's useful to go over them, but because I think that every 5-color deck is going to be a little bit different, or 4 to 5-color deck, a multicolor deck, it's going to be a little bit different. Its needs are going to be a little bit different. But if you're just like, I'm not exactly sure where to go with these 5-color decks, like what are the guidelines, you stick to make sure you've got multicolor fixers, ideally 4, 5 of them. If your splashing tools, like the things that are helping you splash, are green cards, which they often are, you want to weight your mana base towards forests, right? So that you have the green sources to unlock the rest of your cards, right? If you're a 5-color deck and you don't draw that green source, it's just a disaster, right? Because then you have nothing castable. So yeah, anytime that the 5-color fixture is a green card, you want to weight your green sources a little bit heavy. Maybe instead of 8 or 9 green sources as your mana base in your lands, you're playing like 10 or 11. And one final thought on decks that are splashing, basically any decks that are splashing. While your main priority is to make sure you've got the sources somewhere in your deck, the mana sources. Another thing that you do generally want to prioritize is card draw, or ways to see more cards. Because, again, we go back to why we play the number of sources we do for a given number of cards. 3 or 4 sources for one card, for example. That's all predicated on the number of cards you expect to see over the course of the game. And so if you have card draw or scrying, that makes your fixing situation a bit better, because you're not just relying on seeing one card per turn from the top of your deck and hoping it's good enough. You're instead actually able to sculpt your draws and find exactly what you need. It's the old meme of card draw is fixing, right? You'll hear people say that, like, what's your fixing? Oh, my card draw is fixing. And, it is true to some extent. It really is. So this is something you're going to want in your slower decks anyways. Like, card draw is just good in slower decks. But part of the reason you want it is so you can find your sources for your splash cards a little more often. All right, so we're mostly done talking about colors and splashing and multicolor decks. Now let's talk about land counts. So, the gold standard, 17 lands. It's the gold standard for a reason. The 2 main reasons it's the gold standard is, 1, to make sure you've got enough sources in your deck, right? Like, 8's the bare minimum, but sure is nice to have 9, right? And 2, we play 17 lands so that we can hit 4 lands on turn 4 with consistency. The reason why 4 lands on turn 4 matters is because that's about the number that the average limited deck wants to get to, so it can just be functional. Right, you don't want to stumble on 3 lands. You want to really get to that 4th land so you can cast your 4 drops. You can double spell 2 drops. If you're stuck on 3 lands, often that means that you can't double spell, can't cast your more expensive cards. If you're stuck on 4 lands for a while, you can usually do okay. So yeah, that's the main reason that we play 17 lands. And I think you should play 17 lands in more decks than people think. People like going into 16 lands because they don't like the feeling of getting flooded. But I'm not playing 16 lands if I've got any number of 5 drops, if I'm splashing, because if you're splashing, you need more room for more sources. If you have 5 drops or 6 drops, heaven forbid 6 drops, definitely shouldn't play 16 lands. Especially these days, they tend to design sets where you naturally have ways to spend your mana on things just as the game goes on. Just the whole idea of you rarely run out of things to do in Modern Limited. That means you should push towards more lands rather than fewer. And I even mean this for your aggro decks too. Ham TV, Kyle Rose, has a really good kind of theory on this. The way he puts it is that people like to cut lands from their aggro decks, again, because they don't, when they draw their 7th land, it doesn't do too much. But for aggro decks, it's actually more important for them to hit their lands. They hit, 4 lands on 4, than it would be for a slower deck. Because if a slower deck misses its 4th land, its 5th land, whatever, it can come back. If you're behind a little bit as a more mid-rangey deck, maybe you catch up by casting a good 6-drop. Ketcherdon, for example, migrating Ketcherdon from Aether Drift. That's a way to kind of get yourself back in the game. But as the aggro deck, you don't have that luxury, right? You need to go 1, 2, 3, 4, curve out. And if you stumble, if you ever miss your land drops and can't cast your cards, that's the opponent's opportunity to be like, oh, okay, well, they stopped attacking this turn, now I stabilize. So, yes, it is worse for your aggro deck to draw a few more lands in the late game. It is so much worse for your aggro deck to not hit that 4th land on time or that 3rd land on time. So what are our exceptions? When do I like to play 16 lands? Well, when you're monocolored, that's when you can definitely go to 16 lands, because then you're not too worried about the sources, right? Like, you just need, 8 sources, that's really easy. You're going to have 16 sources. Sometimes, even in your very low curve, like mono red decks, you'll go to 15 lands, but that's pretty rare. Most formats don't generally support that, right? So I really only want to go to 16 lands if I don't have 5 drops, my curve stops at 4, and I only have a few 4 drops. My colored requirements are easy. I don't have double pipped cards. Ideally, you're mostly one color. Like, maybe you're a red-white aggro deck with like 5 white cards. That's reasonable. If you've got a dual land in there, so you can keep up that number of sources, like a red-white dual land, then I feel a little more comfortable going to 16 lands. But again, I think, there's one kind of unintuitive piece of advice I'd give today is just play more lands in your aggro decks. When I do deck techs looking at aggro decks, I'll add a land so much of the time. I'm just like, yeah, no, this is not a 16 land deck. Because I think a lot of people's instinct is just like, well, I am aggro, I should play 16 lands. And it's not as simple as that. I would say in most of my aggro decks, I actually am just still playing 17 lands. There's also the best of one hand smoother if you're playing best of one on Arena. And there's been, much debate over the years about whether the hand smoother means you should play 16 lands or you should play 17 lands. I'm of the opinion that it doesn't actually change what you should do too much, because the analysis I always go back to is something that Sirkovitz has done in the past, where he said, yes, in best of one, you are more likely to be able to hit that third land with the hand smoother, but it actually makes it harder to hit anything past that. The way that the distributions work. So, I don't have the article on hand. You can probably go search that if you'd like, or, bother Sirkovitz about that. But the conclusion that he came to at the time is that, no, it is still usually better to play 17 lands, even in best of one. And then 18 lands, when do you play 18 lands? Well, most often I play 18 lands in that situation I described when we're talking about splashing, where I just need another source in there. I'm just like, okay, well, my splash is maybe slightly sketchy. Maybe I'll add an 18th land, another basic land on my splash source. Sometimes when my deck ends up with a clunky curve, I don't end up with a lot of 2-drops. Let's just say I end up with, 6 or 5 cards that I'm casting before turn 3. That's when I'll play 18 lands, because it's more important to hit 4 on 4 and 5 on 5, basically. So the higher the curve, intuitively makes sense. Higher the curve, the more you want the 18th land. But yeah, again, I think the stamp I'm going to put on this is just play 17 in the vast majority of your decks. I really think that if you're looking for long-term consistency, that's what you're aiming for. Not to say there's not exceptions. Of course there are. I highlighted them here. But I think people's intuition pushes them to 16 lands more often than they should be there. Now, there are some cards that you can cut lands for because they basically act like a tapped land. So cards I'm talking about here are 1-mana land cyclers, and we don't see this very often. We saw this in the Lord of the Rings set with Troll of Khazad-dûm and Lorien Revealed. So if you ever have something that can go get a land for a single mana, you can take out your first basic land for that. Same thing with any of these green sorceries like Bushwhack that search your library for a basic land, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Fountain Port Bell from Bloomburrow, very similar. It's a 1-mana card that goes and gets a land, makes it so your next draw is a land card. If your thing that goes and gets a land is a single mana, it makes it okay to cut a land for it, because in opening hand with like 1 land in one of these is essentially a 2-land hand, right? You can kind of just think of it as a tapped land. It spends your turn 1. You can't cut too many lands for these generally. 1 would be, bordering on my max. Sometimes you cut 2 if your, curve is very, very low. Rarely I would do that. But the first one, yeah, for sure. When you get to elves, mana dorks that do a similar thing, it gets a little bit fuzzier. So let's take a 1-mana mana dork. So Llanowar Elves, single green mana, taps to make green mana. And I generally don't count them as just a land, because a percentage of the time your opponent will kill it on turn 1. So roughly the way I look at it is like every 2 Llanowar Elves I would cut a land. Once you start getting to like 2-mana elves, like a Paradise Druid or something, I don't think you can really comfortably cut lands for those. If you happen to have a lot of them, like you end up with like 5 mana dorks or something, yeah, then I can see you going to 16, even if some of those are like, 2-mana mana dork. But you really just want to be hitting your mana sources early in the game. You don't want to mess with that too much. Like, you also don't want to get flooded, right? That's why there is some wiggle room here. But I think when in doubt, don't cut a land for your 2-mana mana dork. And I think especially don't cut lands for like 3-mana mana rock. So if you have like Starting Column or something like that, I wouldn't cut a land. It does mean, if you've got these cards in your deck, Starting Column, Veloheart Bike, it does mean that you have more mana sources than you would like generally. For those last two, Veloheart Bike and Column, it's actually nice because they give you something to do later, right? The Column draws you cards and the Bike turns into a vehicle. But in some other formats, the Mana Fixers or the Manalith variant, the 3-mana Mana Rock, isn't as good as these kind of cards are. And so you're just putting an additional mana source in your deck, which makes you go, okay, well, maybe I do want to cut a land. I don't think that's great because you need to get to 3 lands to get to, casting your Starting Column or whatever the Manalith is. So, you kind of shoot yourself in the foot there. I think the solve for that is just put more stuff in your deck to cast, right? Put more expensive cards in your deck, put more card draw in your deck, have more ways to use the mana. You can also sometimes cut a land when you have a lot of 1-mana cantrips, so 1-mana cards that draw you a card. Consider, as an example, single blue mana, Surveil 1, draw a card. because they kind of act like the Bushwhack, the Land Cycler, the 1 mana thing that goes and gets a land. This is what you'll see in some constructed formats from time to time, where they'll have a bunch of cantrips and maybe shave a land or two, because some percentage of the time when you cast your Consider, it will be a land. So yeah, if I've got these cantrips, I will consider I will consider going down a land, but not if my curve is high, and not if my base color is not blue, or whatever color the cantrip is, because you need to be able to, if you're missing lands, get out of this situation by casting the cantrip. If you're like, all right, I'm a blue-black deck, but more heavy on black, just because you have 2 Considers doesn't mean you can cut a land, because you'll just like draw a bunch of swamps and be mana screwed. And I quickly just want to go back to the point I made a second ago about putting more stuff to do with your mana in your deck. So if you find yourself consistently flooded, in your decks, like you're just like, man, I'm so unlucky, I always get flooded. I mean, to start with, nobody is more lucky or less lucky than anybody else, but it might be a systemic issue, right? Like, it might be the case that in your slower decks, like, you're just drafting too many cheap cards, which is something that, you often hear content creators warning, make sure you draft cheap cards, But once you have enough cheap cards, and I would say in your slower or mid-range decks, enough cheap cards is like 8 things to do before turn 3. If you're there, you actually do want to draft more expensive cards. Want to make sure that if you're putting some sort of additional mana sources in your deck, you want to make sure that at some point, once you get past turn 4 or 5, you don't run out of things to do. So yeah, I'm just saying this as a push for those who are just like, yeah, I like my 16 lands, maybe it's not the most correct, but I get flooded all the time. I just think it's such a disaster to not be hitting your early lands, and you're just going to lose so many games, or you just miss that 3rd or 4th land drop. And yeah, the easy fix is just find more stuff to spend your mana on. Play an extra card draw spell, play an extra 6-drop. Maybe you play a, some sort of tormenting voice effect to discard additional lands. That's one point too. I didn't even think about that. But when you have effects like that, Thunderhead Gunner, Tormenting Voice, anything that says discard a card, draw some cards, anyway, to filter your lands, that actually makes you want to play 17 lands more often, because if you draw too many lands, okay, fine, you can pitch them, but if you don't draw enough lands, you might not be able to cast those cards and cast something else, or, in the case of Thunderhead Gunner, it's a 5-drop, you can't cast that card in the first place. And something that might be obvious, but I do think bears saying out loud, is that different formats are going to have you build different kind of mana bases. Not just because some formats are 3-color formats, or some colors are monocolored formats. The latest one we had of those was Eldraine. OG Eldraine was a monocolored format. You often want it to be straight up just one color, or very, very light splash of something else. Faster formats mean that you want to splash less, just going back to you have less time to find those sources. You want to be streamlined, consistent, all that. The existence of dual lands at common, or if they're in the land slot instead, like that dictates how much you're going to want to draft multicolor decks or splashing versus not. In Dominaria United, for example, they had all 10 dual lands at common. And that was a format where most people were splashing in every single one of their decks, right? Like, I would say that the splash rate was like, you'd splash in 60% of your decks, 70% of your decks. But in a set like Aether Drift, where the land is in its specific slot, some packs have them, some packs don't. It means that, maybe 30% of people are splashing here and there, maybe a little bit more. But yeah, just the frequency of mana fixing you're going to see is going to dictate how much you want to splash. The general set infrastructure of the format, like that really matters. And so what that means is that when I learn a new format, that's something I'm on the prowl for. I'm like, all right, well, how willing am I to draft 3 colors, or, 2 colors in a splash, or how often am I just going to be a 2-color deck? There's a lot of formats where it's just like, no, you're just a 2-color deck way more often than not. So that's just good information to know, just kind of clock for every format. So when you jump into a draft, you kind of know where your paths lie, right? What you can expect to see mana fixing wise and what's acceptable in the format. So as we move towards finishing up here, I want to go over a few mental traps to be aware of. As far as mana bases go, I've touched on a few of them here and there, but I just want to give them their own section. So don't be the person that plays less land. You cut a land from your deck because you got flooded, right? Small sample size is the culprit there. You should always just trust the numbers, trust the math. And that's kind of like the big headliner to all these mental traps, is just trust the math. You are but one person playing a finite number of games in your small sample size. Your assessment of the few games that you've played with your deck, or decks over, multiple drafts, is not a big enough sample size to dispute the math, basically, right? Just trust the math. Trust that when you put 17 lands in your deck, sometimes you're going to get flooded. That's always a possibility, but that's also a possibility on 16 or 15 lands. Like, I think, that's one thing I always think is funny when people are like, oh, I got flooded, so I'm going to cut a land. Well, it's just like, that land is really not going to make the biggest difference as far as like sometimes you get flooded, but it will make a difference in your opening hand a lot of the time. So yeah, don't be that person who's just like, I keep getting flooded, I'm going to go to 16 lands. Don't give in to the monkey brain, basically is the way I would put it. A second thing is that, I've laid out a lot of guidelines here for responsible mana bases, and sometimes I'll see a irresponsible mana base. And somebody will point out, "Ooh, man, your mana looks really, really bad." And they'll say something like, "Well, I didn't get mana screwed, so my mana was fine." Again, it's small sample size. Like, there's gonna be games where you don't get mana screwed if you're running a really bad mana base. Like, sometimes you're just like, yeah, you have luck's on your side, you draw just the right lands you need. But one thing I'll say to that even is that, when I'll go over, like, game log reviews for people that I coach, and they'll say, like, "Oh, the mana wasn't very good here, but luckily it wasn't so much of a problem." But I look at their games, and it actually was a problem. So you actually might not even realize where it's a problem. And the problems come in needing to mulligan, right? Some more often than you would if you had good mana. Your opening hand of spells doesn't match up with your opening hand of lands. Or you weren't able to double spell when you really needed to. Or you had a card in hand that was just stuck in your hand for a while, and maybe you eventually cast it, but, those 4 turns that was stuck in your hand, that really mattered, right? And that actually led to your loss. So yeah, this just goes back to trust the math. Don't over-index on your small sample size. Also, I think it's kind of easy to under-index how bad it is just to not cast your cards on time, right? Like the exact situation I just pointed out where it's like, okay, my mana was fine, quote unquote, but I look at the game, they couldn't cast a spell for 4 turns. It's really, really bad. That's basically like you've mulliganed. And mulliganing is not good. As we know, the numbers on mulliganing and limited, when you take a mulligan, it takes a pretty big chunk off your win rate. The unfortunate thing about how we learn Magic, and especially with Arena's ranks, is that when you're playing in lower competitive environments or against an opponent who's maybe not going to pressure you that much, they're kind of like dirtling around, they're taking time to set up their mana, they're casting cards that don't affect the board, the kind of things that you might see on Arena in lower ranks. Whereas if you face people in higher ranks, they're going to steamroll you because they're going to have consistent mana, things to cast on curve. And playing in those lower rank games can kind of train your intuition poorly for what, how it should be tuned. Because if you're like, oh, okay, I can get away with bad mana because, the opponents I face are kind of putzing around. You face those more experienced opponents. Once you get to Platinum, Diamond, Mythic, all that, you're going to be like, oops, my intuition of how kind of dicey I can be with my mana, how loose I can be with it, was not good. It led me to a bad place. It led me to playing fewer lands or more colors or whatever it is. So, I'm giving you all these guidelines from a place of, in the most competitive environments, this is what you should do. Might not be your experience if you're not used to playing these competitive environments, but as you get better, you're going to, and so it's good to practice early on. And finally today, I'm going to leave you with a few tools to figure out, hey, is my mana good in this deck? If, the guidelines are enough, you want to have something to double check your work, basically, give you a few options here. So, tried and true, trusty rusty is the hypergeometric calculator. There's a pretty good one here on etherhub.com. I'll put links to all these tools in the description. But if you haven't used the hypergeometric calculator before, basically the idea, it lets you know the chances of drawing a specific card in your deck or type of card in your deck, given, all these numbers you put in, like how many swamps you have in your deck, how many islands, how many of those you need to see. And basically, can help check with your splash math is a way to figure it out. And as far as the number you're looking for like successful amount of sources. So let's just say, you're plugging in a splash, right? And you're like, okay, well, I've got 4 sources in my deck. I need to see one of those splash sources in my top 15 cards. What's the chance that I'm going to see that in the top 15 cards? And if you calculate it all, and it spits out something that's like around 80%, I think 80% is really what you're looking for a consistency. That's kind of a good way to put it. If you're not exactly sure, this is a bit confusing. There's a bunch of YouTube videos that go over how to use a hypergeometric calculator. I'm sure there's even Magic-specific examples for this, but really good tool. Not just for checking out Manabases, but just anytime you're like, hey, what are the chances I draw this in my deck? Just plug in those numbers. Untap.gg, if you have that extension for Arena, it does it for you, so that's kind of nice too. But yeah, just another tool you can check your mana base on. There's also a new tool that one of the members of the Limited Level Ups community has put together. So this is something really, really cool, actually. It's a website, wooburg.gg, so the magic color is wooburg.gg. And what you do is you plug in your deck list here, paste your deck here, And it spits out a bunch of stats. Tells you the distribution of how many dead spells you're going to have on average. How likely you are to cast certain cards in your deck on curve. Like really a lot of details here for those people who really like to get into the numbers of this kind of stuff. And actually, I put one of my decks through this the other day, and I actually changed my mana base because of it. I was like, oh, because, I was a multicolor deck, and I'm like, oh, I should actually go up a plains, take out a mountain. So yeah, just basically something to double check your work. And again, I'm going to put this in the description. There's also a new tool. They have a Patreon if you want to go support it, if you feel like this is something helpful too. So yeah, I plan to use this myself. And yeah, I would recommend it. And that's going to do it for today's episode. Thank you for watching and listening. If you made it this far and you're on YouTube, do like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Next episode is not going to be next week, not going to be in March. It's going to be April 1st. That's going to be the set review with my set review partner, Mark. Set review for Tarkir Dragonstorm. I'm going to be hosting a few YouTube videos in the week, so, still a bit of content coming this way, but the next actual Limited Level Ups podcast episode will not be until the set review. Anyways, hope you enjoyed this. Be responsible with your mana, and we'll see you next time.